Hi there, my name is Clifford Bates, and welcome to this now session of reading Machiavelli's Prince. In this video today, we're going to be looking at chapter 8 of those who obtained. Those who through wickedness obtained the principate. In other words, the people who gained the principate because of wickedness. That's the chapter. We're using I'm quoting a reading from Leopold de Alvarez's translation of The Prince, published by Waveland Press. A link to that is in the bottom. So let's continue. In the previous last session, we looked at, in chapter 7, we looked at the question of the prince who gets his rule through the fortune and arms of others. Previously, we looked at in chapter 6, we looked at the prince who gained a new prince who gained his power through his own arms and his virtue. Now we're getting the one who obtains a principate through wickedness, not virtue, but the opposite. He starts out this is 9 paragraphs long, so let's pay attention to this. 9 paragraphs long. This is not a short thing. This is long, but a little shorter than the last one. Last one was 15. This is now 9. Let us begin. But because one rises from the prince, from a private station, and becomes a prince in 2 more modes, either of which is wholly attributed to fortune or to virtue, it does not seem to me that I should omit them, even though it is possible to reason on one of them at more length in a treatise on republics. In other words, one of the 2 things, there's 2 more he has to deal with. One should be more about a treatise on republics. In other words, he has 2 more things. He did through arms, acquiring things, through virtue and arms and of your own, and then the other one previous was through fortune and arms of others, right? Now he's dealing with a question that, 2 more questions. He says, there's 2 more questions left. After I deal with those things, I have 2 more questions, and these 2 questions I have to deal with are, what I have to deal with, he's suggesting one of them should be more fitting for a treatise on republics. Okay, and de Alvarez has a note here on this, and this is Discourses. He does so in Discourses 3, okay, part 3, in passing. So therefore, he addresses this again, this question of wickedness and things like that. In other words, this is about a question. These 2, now I'll continue. These 2 modes are when one ascends to the principate by some wicked or nefarious way, or when private citizens, by the favor of his fellow citizens, becomes the prince of his fatherland. So there's 2 modes. The one is you come to wicked means, and the other one is your fellow citizens make you prince. The latter one is clearly the point you said above, to talk about on a treatise for republics. Okay, but we got to be careful, because of them Machiavelli plays with this, because he talks about wickedness there, other place too. So, 2 ways. One is through wickedness, and the other one is through that your fellow citizens make you the prince. Prince of the fatherland, your homeland, your patria. The fatherland here is always patria. And what is said of the first mode will be demonstrated in 2 examples, one ancient and the other modern, without entering otherwise into the merits of such a mode, because I judge it sufficient for whomever would find it necessary to imitate them. In other words, these 2 things should be imitated, okay. So he says there's going to be, therefore this is going to be he's going to be dealing with the first case here of wickedness, right? He's going to give an ancient example and then a modern one, right? And it's the only thing he's going to talk about. Agathocles, the Sicilian, not only from a private but also a low and abject fortune, became king of Syracuse. Now, this is important to know. He was not only a private person, but he was from a low and abject fortune. Now, Machiavelli has a note here. He overthrew the oligarchs in 317, and he's also mentioned in Discourses 2, chapter 12, and chapter 13, and also Discourses 3, chapter 6. So therefore, these are, he's not only addressed in Prince, he's also addressed in the Discourses. Agathocles is that man who was born a potter, always led a wicked life at every stage. Nevertheless, he accompanied his wickedness with such virtue of mind and body that when he joined the militia, he rose through the ranks and became the praetor at Syracuse. Once established in that rank, he determined to become prince and to hold with violence and without obligation of others that which by agreement had been consented to him. Having given intelligence of his plan to Hamilcar, the Carthaginian, who was fighting with his armies in Sicily, he assembled the people in the Senate of Syracuse, and as if to deliberate on things pertinent to the republic. And upon a given signal, he had his soldier kill all the senators and the richest of the people. Once they were dead, he seized and held the principate of that city without any civil controversy. So what did he do? I mean, this was an oligarchy. When he took over, he was made this militia of the oligarchy. The militia was mostly a mercenary army, because the oligarchs don't want to arm the people. So what happened here? This is the thing. The oligarchies tended not to trust the people. If the people were armed, usually the armed element would become the ruling element. Okay, that's a thing in ancient regimes. So therefore, the oligarchies tended to disarm the people in that sense. And therefore, what happened here was the rich don't want to fight. Therefore, they hire mercenaries. They hire the soldiers, and out of that, the hired mercenary army came Agathocles. And then what did he do? In other words, he got a position of authority, and then on a pretext of addressing the Senate, and the citizens in the assembly, he does what? He has the soldiers, on a signal of things, have his soldiers kill all the senators and the very wealthy citizens. Kill the oligarchs. And then why? This, no one but him now. He has the power. And the people are kind of like, they're unarmed and don't have the means to resist him. So he's able to hold the city without any civil controversy. And although he was twice broken in the field by the Carthaginians and ultimately besieged, he was not only able to defend his city, but leaving part of his troop to defend against the siege, he assaulted Africa with others. And in a short time not only liberated Syracuse from the siege, but drove the Carthaginians into extreme necessity. And they were necessary to come to an agreement with him. They had to be satisfied with their possessions in Africa and leave Sicily to Agathocles. Right? You see what he's done here now. Agathocles was so able, in other words, once he left, why would not the people revolt against him? Now, that's another thing. He was just able to leave enough soldiers. He was not only in charge, but he was able to leave his city while it was being besieged, in a way that he's able then to go attack in Africa the Carthaginians in such a way that put him in an extreme situation that was able to force them to abandon their operations there and then defeat them in Africa, so that they would make a deal that they would not have to only care about Africa and not pay attention to Sicily. Okay. Again, this is what I mean. This is an interesting example. Now, this is our third paragraph. He turns on page 52. Whoever might consider the actions of that man will see nothing or little which can be attributed to fortune. For that which he gained, as was said, it was not through favor of anyone, but his ascent through the ranks of the militia with 1,000 hardships and dangers, which principate he then moreover maintained many spirited and dangerous decisions. Still, one cannot call it virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, to betray his friends, to be without faith, without pity, without religion, which mode enabled him to acquire imperium, but not glory. In other words, he's not able to get glory. Right? This is a very interesting thing. De Alvarez has a discussion of and also virtue. In other words, this is a weird thing of virtue. You can't call it virtue. You can't call it virtue. You can't call it virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, betray friends, be without faith, without pity, without religion. Which the modes, in other words, the things that he did, which acquired him, in other words, being without those things, this allowed him to get the imperium. Those things helped him get it. In other words, being able to kill his citizens, to betray friends, to be without faith, without pity, without religion. These are the things that helped him. But they can get you to win, right? They're able to acquire imperium, but not glory. But if one considers the virtue of Agathocles in entering into escaping from dangers, and the greatness of mind in standing up to and overcoming adverse things, one does not see why he should not have to be judged inferior to any excellent captain, of the most excellent captains. Remember, again, this is now semicolon there. Capitino, the captain, is one who professed the art of war, right? Those captains are what? Those captains are the ones we talked about 2 chapters ago. Who are they? Moses, Theseus, Romulus, and Cyrus, right? And Hero, right? These are the great captains who are going to be what? Examples. In other words, he's equivocal. He's pointing that they're going to be. He is what? His greatness of mind, standing over to his verse. One does not see why he should not be. That he should have to be judged inferior to any of those great captains. Nevertheless, his brutal cruelty and inhumanity and his infinite wickedness do not allow him to be among the most excellent celebrated men. Okay, but no, we should not. His virtue, the things that his skill in this does this, he should be done this. But because of what? His brutal cruelty and humanity and his infinite wisdom does not allow him to be among those excellent celebrated men. One cannot then attribute to fortune or virtue that which, without one or the other, was accomplished by him. In other words, fortune and virtue, neither fortune or virtue was at stake with him in that sense. The argument, okay? Now then, what happens here is, in our time, in the reign of Alexander, Ludovico of Fermo, having been left fatherless for a few years earlier, while still little, was raised by one of his maternal uncles, a man named Giovanni Fogelli, and in the beginning of his youth was apprenticed to a soldier under Paolo Vintilli, so that replete with that discipline he might attain some excellent rank in the militia. Afterwards, when Paolo was dead, he soldiered under Vincent, Paolo's brother, and in a very short time, by being ingenuous and being ingenuous and vigorous in his person and mind, he became the first man of the militia. But since it seemed to him a servile thing to be under others, he thought, with the aid of some citizens of Fermo, to whom servitude was dearer than liberty of their patria, of their fatherland, with the favor of the Vintilli, to seize Fermo. He wrote to Genovese Fogelli, explaining how, having had been many years away from home, he wanted to return to sea and his city to acquire and to acknowledge some part of his patrimony. In other words, and because he had not worn himself out in labor other than to acquire honor, in order that his fellow citizens would see that he had not spent his time in vain, he wanted to return honorably, accompanied by 100 horse of his friends and servants, and he prayed that Fogelli be pleased to order that Fermi might receive him honorably, and that he would give honor not only to him, Giovanni, but also to himself, since he had been his pupil. Giovanni, therefore, did not fail in any due office towards his nephew. He made Fermi receive him honorably. Lievetto lodged in his own houses, where he waited to order secretly that which was necessary for his future wickedness. After some days had passed, he had given a most solemn banquet to be which he invited Giovanni Fangelli and all the first men of Fermo. And when the meal and the other entertainments that are usual in such banquets were over, Lievetto, with art, moved a certain serious argument concerning the enterprises of Pope Alexander and of his son Cesare and of their enterprises. Giovanni and the others, responding to those arguments, he suddenly rose up, saying, "These were things that one ought to speak in a more secret place." So he retired into a room where Giovanni and all the other citizens followed him. They were no sooner seated than the soldiers came from secret places and killed Giovanni and all the other. Next paragraph. This is page 54. This is the 7th paragraph. After the homicide, after he killed Giovanni, Lievetto mounted a horse and, coursing the town, besieged the supreme magistrate in the palace, so that from fear they were constrained to obey him and to form a government of which he was made prince. Since all those who were dead who would have been malcontented and able to harm him, he strengthened himself with a new and civil military order. In such a mode, in a year he held that principate. Not only was he safe in the city of Fermo, but all his neighbors feared him. To overthrow him would have been as difficult as overthrowing Agathocles. Yet had he not let himself be deceived by Cesare Borgia, when at Sinigale, as had been said above. In other words, Cesare took the Orselli and Ventrelli, where having also been taken by him 1 year after he committed the patricide, he was, together with Vincenzo, who had been his teacher in virtue and wickedness, strangled. In other words, Cesare strangles them a year later, and does to them what they did. In other words, he fell for the trick. The same thing that happened to him. Now, this is a note 8 here that's interesting because he says, okay, now we'll see this in chapter 7, note 11, okay, above, about this. In other words, there was a kind of mistake he made. He trusted that, and in other words, he and the person who taught him these bad things were strangled by Cesare and Cesare's plot. So therefore, this is interesting that famous at the Sinigale, where that Cesare met and had all his opponents of the what do you call it, the Orsini Vinelli were met, and he exterminated the leaders there. He also exterminated Livrito and his teacher. Okay. So therefore, this is the interesting case. Now, in the next paragraph, this is number 8. One might doubt whether it arose that Agathocles and others like him, having infinite treacheries and cruelties, could long live safe in their fatherland and defend themselves against external enemies, yet never have citizens conspire against them, since there have been many others who have not been able to maintain the state through cruelty even in peaceful times, not to mention the dubious times of war, period. I believe that this comes to pass from cruelty badly used or well used. In other words, he says, period. In other words, he believes that the reason why these people are either succeed or don't succeed is the problem of cruelty. How are you cruel? Is it well used or is it poorly used? I believe that this comes to pass from cruelty badly used or well used. well used one is able to call those cruelties, if one may lawfully call the bad good, which are done in one stroke for the necessity of securing oneself, and which are afterwards not continued within, but converted to the greatest possible utility for the subjects. Stop. Period. Okay, now this next sentence says that cruelty well used is what? That, okay, now it says you can't, it's not lawful to call the bad good, but cruelty well used is the use of force. In other words, you do everything at once, one stroke. You do it once, and then what happens? You make sure that you secure yourself, and then once they're secured, afterwards, you don't have to do it again, and you can. What you're doing, it converts it into the greatest benefit for the utility of the subjects. In other words, the subjects, the people who you ruin, are going to benefit from this. The greatest utility of the subject. That's how the sentence ends. Badly used are those which, though they are at the beginning few, soon increased with time, rather than become extinguished. In other words, it's not you don't use force right away. You use a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit more. In other words, instead of doing all the killing at once, and not having to do any killing at later, you kill a little. You kill a little here and there, and then it keeps on having to do it. He says, and he says what? In other words, badly used are those which, even though they're few in the beginning few, soon increase with time rather than become extinguished. Those who observe the first mode are able to have some remedy for their state with God and with men, as Agathocles did. For the others, it is impossible that they maintain themselves. In other words, okay, if you use cruelty well and do that, you're able to what? You're able to, you did it like Agathocles, and you're able to what? Remedy their state, whatever they're doing, with God and with men. Mention this. In other words, if you use cruelty well, you will be remedied with God and men. What you've done, for the purpose of this. Okay. So the then rank is what? Then he says the one who don't. For the other, it's impossible that they maintain themselves. In other words, if you're trying to be nice and not, I'm going to be nice, I'm not, okay. And then what happens is you have to increasingly do more and more harm to every. In other words, I'm going to hesitate. I'm going to Hamlet. I shouldn't kill these people. I'll just kill this guy, and then you have to kill that guy, and then you have to kill that guy, and then 5 or 6 others, and everyone thinks everyone notices this. And therefore, yeah. Now he will continue this. So in the next paragraph, he goes, whence it is to be noted that in taking a state, the occupier ought to reason out all those offenses that are necessary for him to do. Semicolon. In other words, you're going to take over a thing. You're going to do a deed. You better calculate. You better reason out what do you need to do in order to achieve it. Right? Calculate, ought to reason out all the offenses, all the bad things you have to do in order to achieve what you want to do, right? Then, and this continues, this is page 55, last paragraph, the second sentence. Well, it's part of the first sentence, sorry. Third line from the top of the paragraph. It says, and do them all at one stroke, in order not to have to renew them daily. In other words, you look at whatever have to be done, what do you have to do to do this? And do it once. So you don't have to repeat it. In other words, don't do it. Little this, little that. No. One time. All the killing, all the bad things you got to do. All the bad things you got to do, you do them at one time. Why? Because that way, it's done. It's not. Again, repeat that. Whence it is noted in taking a state, the occupier should reason out all those offenses. In other words, things that you need to do, the bad things, the wicked things you have to do, in order to deliver the people the good things. Okay? You need to do them at the beginning. You need to figure out what they are, and then what he continues, and then you do them at one stroke, not to renew them every day. He is thus able, by not innovating them, to assure men and gain them to himself by benefiting them. This is the second. What is it? Because he's not killing them all the time. He's not doing violence. What he can do, he can what? He can, by not innovating the decision, doing things, in other words, having to innovate the plots. In other words, once you know what you have to do, you do what you do. Now, if you don't do that, what happens is then you have to make a very complex path to do it. Right? Do half steps and half steps and half steps. But this constantly leads you to harming people and doing things that will cause people to hate you, right? And therefore, people are constantly reminded of what these bad things you're doing. Whereas if you do them at once, well, what happens is people may forget that. In other words, he says that what? He says, in other words, assure men and gain them to himself by benefiting them. You assure, in other words, how do you get people to? You need to get people to forget about the bad things, and now remember the things. How do you do that? Time. But if you're doing it all the time, now that's the problem. But if you did it back then, time, people forget, and people will remember the good you do now. Then if you keep on doing benefit, if they're benefiting, if they feel better, if all of a sudden their lives are better now than before, they might not. They'll forget. They'll forget. They won't remember the things, the bad things. Okay? He continues here. Thus he is able, not by innovating then, to assure them and gain them to himself. Right? And whoever does otherwise, either by timidity or bad counsel, is always necessitated to hold the knife in hand. Okay. In other words, if you're that's a semicolon. The sentence continues. In other words, if you don't do that, if you don't kill them all at once, do that, and you do it out of timidity or advice. People say you're either because you're kind of, you're the Hamlet, you're not doing, or because you're advised. Well, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you should take little measures and little. You need to be. You need to look respectable to other people. You can't look bad. You must be good. But this is the famous line: "You must be good. We can't do that because we look bad." No. If this is required to win, this is required. You need to achieve victory, you do it. You don't care if why, because if you make it too complex and you always have to then retaliate and create things, then what happens? You are constantly with knife in hand, right? He says constantly with knife in hand. If you do it through timidity and that, you're going to always have to respond to the problems, and then you're going to have knife in hand. And what happens? He says, nor can he ever rely on his subjects, since they are unable, because of fresh and continually injuries, to assure themselves of him. In other words, you can't now rely on the rest of the subjects. Because why? Because they're thinking, well, wait a minute, you're using the knife all the time. Maybe I'm going to be next. In other words, the fact that you're taking, if you do it all at once, and you're not doing it again, people will think, oh, maybe that was an accident, okay? But if you're doing it all the time, you're harming and you're making. Let's not use the murder example. Let's use I have to fire people. I know that there's going to be a downturn in the situation. I'm going to what? I know we're having a recession. I know we're going to have a problem, and I need to. And I know the economy situation, and we're not going to be able to keep the workforce, and we'll probably have to reduce the workforce by 20%, 30%. Oh, but someone says, so the best thing you should do is once you know you have to do this, do it immediately. You fire the 30 people. The 30% that you have to fire them immediately. Some say, "Oh no, let's wait and do it like overseas. Let's test to see who's the better worker and who's not." Others they say, "Let's delay. Let's only do a little bit now. Maybe things will get better in about 2 months and 3 months. In other words, in a month or so, maybe next quarter will change and we can alter this." In other words, this is what I mean. This is the danger, because why? You fired 5% now, and then a month later 5% again, and you keep on firing and firing and firing, and all of a sudden, what? All the workers think, "Oh my God, I can get fired." If you did that 30% once, and now for 3, 5, 6, the next 6 months, you're not firing anyone, people think, "Oh, I'm safe," and therefore, what? They can be assured of your event. You know, they look at you, can say, "Okay, okay, that was done. Things are stable now. The stability here, I can see why it was done. I'm safer. I'm more. I'm not in fear now. I don't have my fear of the situation. The company's better, back in track, and therefore I'm secure, and therefore I can forget." In other words, I'm safe. The workers and my subjects will still feel the utility of my being in charge. But if I have done that and everyone isn't terrified that they're going to be fired and everyone's insecure, they're not all supportive of my camp. And therefore, if someone wants to remove me, or an outside company wants to, I'm not able to defend my position here. Okay, if I have to rely on the support of the workers. Okay, not going to happen. So therefore, this is the danger of this. Now, what? Again, I'll repeat that sentence. We're talking about here. In other words, if he's thus able, not by innovating, to assure men and gain themselves by benefiting them, right? And whoever does otherwise, in other words, they don't do their things right away, either by timidity or bad counsel, is always necessitated to hold a knife in hand. Nor can he ever rely on his subjects, since they are unable, because of fresh and continual injuries, to assure themselves of him. So in other words, if you've done all things, you can gain their assurance. If you don't do that and are constantly doing it, you don't. How do you gain? In other words, the question here is, how do you gain the assurance of the subject? You get the assurance by the subject as you don't do something. If they see you doing vicious, horrible things all the time, they will think that of you. They will expect that of you. If you did it once and not other times, they won't necessarily expect that of you in that sense. Rather, if you're doing all this, if everything now your rule is giving them is beneficial, and their stability, they'll remember. If they're experiencing stability, and they're not experiencing your violence any longer, it's a thing in the past. You can be assured. They will say, "Man, this is not. This I'm." In other words, you can't always, as we'll say later, you don't always trust the people in that sense, but you can be assured to some degree in a sense, he says. And he says this: of all the injuries, for all the injuries ought to be done altogether. For being tasted less, they offend less. Okay, that's a great line. All the injuries have to be done at the beginning. If they're tasted, in other words, if they're not continually being tasted. In other words, he says that if the injuries is not continually occurring, and they're being always experienced or tasted, he uses the word tasted. If for being tasted less, they offend less. Now he says the benefits ought to be done little by little, so that they may be tasted better. In other words, the benefit. Don't do the benefits all at once. Benefits should be spread out. The benefits should come, and it should be that when they get the benefits, that they taste them. Don't give the benefits that are consumed right away, because they'll forget them. In other words, it uses the metaphor of taste, lingering taste. That taste. If you do the injuries, and all they taste is the injury, the sourness of this. The sourness, causing the injuries leaves a sour flavor, and the only thing they remember is the sour flavor. But if the sweet and the beneficial thing, don't let them consume it right away. Let them continue to experience it. Spread it out. So what happens? In other words, this is the opposite. The bitterness you should have at once, they will forget. The same thing with the good. If they give them all at once, they'll forget. In other words, people forget over time. This is another thing. People over time have short memories. They don't remember the things. And they trust what is at hand, what they experience, what is they now, what are they tasting now? And if it's bitter or sweet. So therefore the little sweetness is much better than the bitter taste, right? So he says, I'll continue. And the benefits ought to be done little by little so that they tasted better. And a prince ought, above all, to live with his subjects in such a mode that no accident, either good or bad, will make him vary his policy. So in other words, whatever accident, you don't vary your policy. You keep your policy the same. Don't change your policy towards this. Don't all of a sudden, whatever fortune. In other words, when no accident, in mode that no accident, either good or bad, will make you change your fortune. If you know what your policy is, you do it. Don't let the fortune or accidents force you off your policy. For necessity coming with adverse times, you cannot be in time with the bad, nor will the good that you do help you, because it is judged to be force, and you do not know any thanks. In other words, if you're being this way, in other words, this is, and the you here is the familiar you. Okay, this is an interesting. In other words, for necessity coming with adverse times. For necessity coming with adverse times, you, very informal, cannot be in time with the bad, nor will the good that you do help you, because it's judged to be forced, and you will not be any thanks. In other words, if you're a good guy, you don't know how to be bad. You don't have the ability to do the bad things you need to do. And adversity, bad time comes, and you don't know how to be bad. Okay, what? You won't, as he says here, you won't be in time. And if you're good, they won't. If you're good in the bad time, you're trying to be benefit. Oh no! See that good is not really you. You're being forced to do it. So you don't benefit from being good, and you can't learn to be bad quick enough. That's a very interesting. The wickedness. Know how you have to be bad when you need it. You need to be able to be bad when you need it. You can't learn to be bad in that sense. He's saying, and then you won't do it well. You won't. In other words, learning being bad will probably lead you to cruelty poorly used. It will lead you to do with the knife what he says you shouldn't do. That is, you do a little bit. You don't do everything you need to do done. So don't react. In other words, he's saying here, he ends it with don't react to the such time. If you've done some policy, stick to it. Why? Because at a certain time, if you try to be good, you're not going to get credit for it. They're going to think it's because the times require you to do it. And you won't know how to be bad, and you won't do it well if you're going to try to be bad. Well, that's our enough for this. And this time, this ends our chapter here. Again, we're using this is the Alvarez's translation of the Prince. The link is below to find out where. If you liked what we've said here, or if you have a comment or a question, please put it in the comment area, below or on the side, wherever they put the comments these days. If you liked the video, if you enjoyed what we said and you liked it, please like it. Share it with a friend. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, please subscribe. Again, if you have, and if you want to ask me something, any suggestions or anything else, you can follow me on social media. That's linked below. Okay, take care and have a good day.